Hi, Greg Curtis here again. I just a video as requested for a couple of things like data analysis and so on. I'll do this one with that, and another video on the early years elementary portfolio designs. Okay, so I just wanted to sort of just back it up a little bit. When I talk about impacts, I talk about those big, as you call them, transformational goals for learning that are often kind of latent, we'll call it that, in education, and they're not very well operationalized. So I just want to go through because it helps with understanding the data and what we can do with it. So we take something like global mindedness, which is often a goal we find in mission statements, and we break it down. In this case, this is an example from a school I worked with. We break it into cultural literacy, systems thinking, empathy, global awareness, to be more precise and to have language to talk about what it means to demonstrate global mindedness. And then we can walk through what I do is, I think I mentioned continua, where I have research-based indicators, performance indicators under each performance area, cultural literacy, systems thinking, etc., that for bands of grades that describe some of the things that a student might demonstrate or do to demonstrate a component of global mindedness. So this gives us something to look for when we're designing curriculum, designing assessment tasks, looking at student work, etc., and gives us something specific to provide feedback on. So when we, let's go to the next one. So this is what I call it, I think I mentioned for you, the looking for. Those are the indicators, those types of things that we want to look for. And this is for self-directed learning. And the types of things we might look at are the sources of evidence that we might use, okay? Because we need to be able to provide, in my view, specific feedback on specific demonstrations, things that we can point to and talk to students about. So I'll just move on to the next. And this notion that new goals require new metrics, that we can't put it on a same scale as other things or give a percentage or a letter grade, because that doesn't service those goals appropriately, I don't believe. So what I do is I look at breaking down the performance areas of impact, so subcategories, and categorizing them along two lines. One, a level of cognitive skill that is interdisciplinary in nature, and sets of dispositions. And I believe those are two different types of learning goals, and they need to be treated differently because how they are learned, how they are demonstrated, what our goals are with those learning goals are different. And so the first part is I like to make that distinction between those pieces. And I look at the goal of each thing. So cognitive skill, the goal really is proficiency. We want to see that a student is good at doing that thing, using tools and strategies to do that thing. So I use a sliding scale based on proficiency language, target being the indicators that are there. That's sort of the meeting. I don't like to use standards-based language with this because I think, again, they're separate, and I don't like to treat the indicators as standards. They are examples of the types of things that students would do to demonstrate the impact. So in this way, we can look at a student's progress over time, and we can give them appropriate feedback to the demonstration of those cognitive skills. Dispositions, our goal is different. It's not, there's no 100% empathy, right? We can't measure it against a task like that. You can't become proficient at resilient. It just doesn't make sense. So I believe that our goal really is development and automaticity. And by automaticity, I mean something that becomes innate and can be called upon when needed by the student in various situations. Okay, so that's a level of automaticity like we would seek with reading. And so I use a developmental scale, moving from emerging to highly developed. And I use sort of the language of the 4 levels of learning that I've adopted in here about unconsciously undeveloped, consciously underdeveloped, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's one of those things that is helpful to students, and the descriptors in terms of how they demonstrated that element, whether it's empathy in designing a solution to a problem, whether it's resilience and working through tough problems. There are tools and strategies that kids can be introduced to. And I think those tools and strategies are extremely important. And then we can give kids feedback on that. So this is a way in which, as I think I mentioned, we can look at growth over time, but we can also give them specific feedback on specific instances, the things that we're looking for and the things that we're looking at. And then, as I mentioned, so I see really the data coming from three different areas: academic standards, a standards-based grading scale, for instance, cognitive skills with that a proficiency scale, and dispositions with a developmental scale. And that gives us the opportunity to look at tasks in which they might overlap, academic standards and a cognitive skill, or in a disposition, whatever it might be. We bring all those together in our criteria for giving feedback on an assessment task or a project the kids are doing. Now, you asked what the learning board looks like. This is a mock-up. So we're trying several different things, but if you can see, a student logs in and they will be able to see both their academic, and in this case it says the 4 C's, their impacts. And they can see it's a dynamic data visualization, so they can click on any of the wedges and it digs down and goes to their evidence and their feedback on those areas, and their self-assessments and so on those areas. So it gives them that option. Analytics means they can go in and they can say, well, I want to look at my critical thinking over the last 2 months in math and science, right? So it gives them just ways to query the data that's collected in here. Or I want to see all my feedback that I got on service learning opportunities that I did. My evidence is a portfolio piece. This is where it's student controlled area, where students will not only contribute evidence, but reflect, self-assess, and interact with that evidence on a regular basis. My goals, I think we discussed, is a goal setting area, access to the latest assessment, alerts and so on. The calendar, I think I mentioned the calendar driven nature of much of what comes out of foundations in terms of the curriculum and the distribution of resources, the units, the assessments, the learning activities, etc. in that area. And then when we get to the data is, if we're capturing data from all these points, but all these different types and sources of data, but they're organized around those 3 categories, it allows us to be able to do things pretty easily in terms of how we can slice and dice that data. Here's an example of something I did with a school in Australia. This actually went on the report card, where one of the wedges, colored wedges, was the student self-assessment. The other was the teachers, the aggregate, right, of that student's teachers, their feedback on those areas, impacts and the performance areas. And that went on a report card. It's part of student self-reporting that we did in that, because they're using the same scales to self-assess, because those things are consistent. So in other words, we don't have a rubric for critical thinking and another rubric for being globally aware, and then another rubric for this and another rubric for that. We have a standard set of scales that flattens the feedback in a good way and makes it easier for kids to connect their learning across disciplines, across years, etc. And as a teacher, I can go in at reporting time or whenever, and I can pull up, this case it's English language arts and the strand of writing, and it shows me in the dots on the graph all the points of data that we have, the feedback that we have from all the standards underneath the strand of writing. I can choose to look at my own summative feedback as a teacher, my formative feedback, a student summative feedback. So if I've asked them to self-assess an element of a task, and their self-assessments on their artifacts or their portfolio evidence. So I can gather those things and interact with them easily in a way that allows me to do so. And that we can look at how we might do reporting differently. So this is, rather than having standard static fixed term reporting, we can have reporting that is pushed out to parents and students when it's right. At the end of a unit or whatever it might be. In this case, it just shows a sample from, again, an ELA, pushes it out. Again, all these data visualizations are dynamic, so I can click on one of those as a parent or a student and see the feedback that my child's been given for the tasks that have involved that speaking or listening or whatever it might be over the course of a while. And the radiating donut rings indicate the sort of levels of proficiency that have been fed back on. Okay, this case, this is looking at a school district, and so they can look at performance and growth across a number of their schools and their districts around their impacts, in which cases there's the 4 C's in those areas. So what I like to do is, just again, all this is dynamic. So I want to make sure that this is an evidence-based system, right? So if I click on a dot on that graph we saw before, or a wedge, and dig down, I can actually see the source of that feedback. Okay, in this case, it pops up. This has an assessment description, a comment from the teacher, right? So the teacher has given this feedback to the student in the system. It shows where they were on the standards involved and the impacts that were involved as well. Evidence is there, either uploaded by students to support their assessment task, or by the teacher and so that's available too. So I can actually see the student video or whatever it is. Maybe the teacher's taking a picture of the presentation, whatever it might be, I have access to it here. So I can drill down to look at the evidence because in my mind, evidence is something we should be using with kids to have conversations about. So I can look at, let's say it's one of these, a dot here, and say, wow, this one's really quite low. Let's have a look at this. Or, you know, your self-assessment was really different from my assessment of this. Let's have a look at it. And it means that you can then go and look and have those conversations, or for, you know, parent-teacher conference or whatever it might be. Okay, so that's just an overview of how we capture the feedback around a simple set of metrics that allow us to slice and dice and visualize and engage people in the evidence of learning. Okay, and that's about it for this video. I'll do one in a second on the portfolio piece for younger kids, and thanks for watching.